All right, let's jump right in. We're going back to 1843, to a story about what seemed like an incredible ancient discovery. But what if it wasn't a discovery at all? What if it was a trap, one designed to test a prophet? This thing is a fascinating historical puzzle. And you know what? It took more than 100 years to really figure it out.
And that really is the heart of it, isn't it? What happens when something that looks like ancient history is actually a modern-day trap? We're talking about a secret plot, a really clever setup meant to challenge a prophet right at the core of his authority.
Okay, so our first stop, an ancient American discovery. And this all kicks off in a pretty sleepy town in Illinois. The year is 1843, April to be exact, in a little place called Kinderhook. You've got a group of guys digging in an old burial mound, and what they say they found, well, it was just unbelievable.
So what did they pull out of the ground? Get this, 6 small bell-shaped brass plates, and they're covered in these strange, totally unknown characters. They're found right alongside a human skeleton, which just adds to the mystery. Of course, the local and church newspapers go wild with it, and boom, instant excitement. Everyone's asking the same thing. What on earth are these things?
Next up, the prophet's examination. So with all this buzz, where do the plates go? Well, they're brought to the one man many people believed could actually read them. They're taken over to Joseph Smith. And this is the moment everything hinges on. According to an account published in the Official History of the Church, which itself was based on a journal entry from his scribe, Smith said this: "I have translated a portion of them and find they contain the history of the person with whom they were found. He was a descendant of Ham, through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." So right there, it sounds like a definitive claim, a successful translation.
And now we get to the big twist, a 19th century hoax. The shocking truth is revealed. For a long time, it looked like the story was settled. A lost ancient record had been found and translated. But yeah, decades later, the whole thing just gets blown wide open.
Just look at this timeline for a second. It's pretty wild. The plates are discovered in 1843. But it's not until 1879, that's 36 years later, that one of the guys involved confesses. And the final scientific proof? That doesn't come until 1981. We're talking almost 140 years. It's no wonder this debate went on for so long.
And here's the confession, straight from the source. One of the men, Wilbur Fugate, wrote a letter in 1879 laying it all out. He said, "Those plates are a humbug gotten up by Robert Wiley, Bridge Whitten, and myself. We concluded to prove the prophecy by way of a joke." So there you have it. It was a prank, a trap, from the very beginning.
Okay, so fast forward to the 1980s. Science finally gets to weigh in. There was one plate left, and they put it under the microscope. Literally. The conclusion? It was a total 19th century creation. You could see the characters were etched with acid, and the metal itself wasn't ancient. It was a fake, plain and simple. And to their credit, the church publicly acknowledged it was a hoax in their Ensign magazine in 1981. Case closed? Or was it? So that leads us to the real question, right? Revelation or research? What did Joseph Smith really do? We know the plates were fake, so what about that translation? This is where the story gets really complicated, and the debate splits into 2 completely different camps. You basically got 2 competing views on what happened. On one hand, you have the critical view. This was a prophetic test, and Joseph Smith failed it. He claimed to translate fraudulent plates, which calls his whole gift of translation into question. But then there's the apologetic view. This was a secular academic attempt. The argument is that Smith didn't use revelation at all. He just tried to figure it out like any other scholar, using his own study materials. So let's look at the key piece of evidence here, William Clayton's actual journal. The official history says, "I have translated." But Clayton's original entry says, "President Joseph has translated a portion and says." It's a subtle difference, right? Third person versus first person. But for that second argument, it's a huge deal. Yeah, it was common back then to change diary entries to first person for biographies. But that little change in wording is at the center of this whole debate. And this is where something called the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, or JAL, comes into play. You have to remember, back in 1835, Joseph Smith and his team were deep into studying Egyptian papyri. The JAL was basically their homemade study guide, their attempt to figure out what all these different Egyptian characters meant. So, the secular translation theory puts the pieces together like this. First, Joseph Smith sees a specific boat-shaped character on the Kinderhook plates. Second, he thinks, hey, that looks a lot like a symbol we have in our study guide, the gal. And third, he looks up the meaning for that symbol in the gal and gives an explanation based on that, not based on a revelation from God. And, importantly, after that, he seems to have just lost interest. He never mentions it again, never produces any scripture from it. It was just a quick look, a comparison, and then he moved on.
Which brings us to the big question: why the plates still matter? I mean, it's a historical prank with very real modern-day stakes. Why are people still arguing so passionately about a hoax from almost 200 years ago? Well, it's because the stakes are just incredibly high for everyone involved.
Here's the core of the whole controversy. For critics, the logic is simple. If Joseph Smith failed a testable translation like this one, how can you trust the untestable ones, like the Book of Mormon? It casts a shadow over everything. But for believers, it shows something completely different. It shows Smith acting as a curious scholar, not as a prophet in this specific instance, which means the trap set to discredit his prophetic gift actually missed its mark.
A really prominent critical source, the CES letter, puts it in this very stark, memorable way. It asks, wouldn't you buy a third car from a man who had already sold you 2 clunkers? The point of the analogy is to suggest a pattern, questioning Smith's translation record after controversies surrounding both the Book of Abraham and these Kinderhook plates.
So where does that leave us? Was this a failed test, a major prophetic blunder, or is it just a lesson in context, a small misunderstood moment? The mystery of the Kinderhook plates is still with us, and maybe, in the end, they tell us less about what happened in 1843 and more about how we, today, choose to look at the evidence.